Hey guys, so today you and I are going to talk about building your own tools. So let's get into it. So the question in question was, hi Frederick, what kind of skills does someone need to have if they are building some tool slash framework like an ORM or Axios, for example, or any other things, since building those kinds of things are a lot different from building REST APIs of some sort. Building a REST API of some sort. Uh, so the longish, like the simple answer is that you need to understand what these tools are giving you and understand how they're built, and you understand the fundamental value that they are offering and how they are like actually doing that. If you're taking an ORM as an example and something like Axios, which is just like it's a JavaScript. For those of you who don't know it, it's just a JavaScript library for doing network requests, like in a slightly nicer interface. It's basically a nicer way of using Fetch or one of the browser's native network APIs. So, with these two specific examples, so if we take the ORM for example, now you will probably need to figure out what is an ORM. It stands for Object Relational Mapping, if I can remember correctly. What does it actually do? Well, the short version of it, I'm not going to dive into it all that much, but this is sort of like the way you go about it. It's the same thing if you want to create your own version. I mean, this is sort of the in-depth knowledge, if that makes sense, that I've talked to people about before, like core skills. Where you actually understand how the tools that you are using actually work. You don't just know the tool, because a lot of people just know that, oh yeah, you need what, Mongoose, if it's, I'm assuming this is JavaScript or something, because you're mentioning Axios as well. Oh, you need Mongoose to do things in MongoDB, but the reality is that that's actually, if you only know about that tool, then you really only know the tools, like you know the interfaces. It's sort of like saying that you know how to work with a computer, but what you really actually know is that you know how to use the operating system, and you don't actually really know the operating system, you know how to click the boxes. That's sort of what I'm talking about. You know the UI and the interfaces and what can be done with an operating system, but you don't actually understand how things work under the hood. And the deeper you go, the more of an understanding you have of these concepts. So for an ORM, for example, the very basic version of what it does is that it allows you to convert from having queries, like you actually writing out a query towards the database that fetches some type of result set, into very easy to digest interfaces that you can use in your code, so you don't have to write that code manually, because the vast majority of these queries are identical. So people came up with the idea of, all right, let's create, I mean, in Java, for example, and C# and so forth, they have like annotation systems. There are other ways of doing it, of course, but I think that those are probably the ones that people most feel comfortable with when they talk about ORMs, where you have a way to take a class or an object structure, a DTO, call it whatever you want, or a struct, and basically say that, hey, this data, this structure here, I want to make a very simple query to fetch that information from the database. And so the ORM will do is allow you to express in code or configurations or something like that how to instantiate an instance of that data structure based on some ID or something like that. And then you can also usually use an ORM to actually both write things to the database and read them without having to, as I said, manually write out the query strings with all the properties and all that stuff by hand. And so if you understand that part, well, if you wanted to build your own ORM, then it really comes down to you figuring out, okay, so how can I, in a very accessible way for the users, because you're basically designing the interface. This is like, you're not inventing a new piece of technology per se. Well, you can say that, of course. What you're really doing is that you're just trying to simplify something that people could do without the ORM, because you can work without an ORM. It's just more convenient in some cases. So now you have to figure out, all right, so how do I, in a nice and easy way, create all these template strings or like template queries in whatever database you're creating an ORM for, so that, and then create a nice simple interface so that I'm saving the consumer of my tool, like my library user, the time of writing out all that stuff by themselves. And then you need to figure out how can you instantiate like data structures from the database and execute all those queries without in a a reusable way, because you don't really know who's going to be consuming it, so forth. I can give you a hint about like things like reflection in Java, for example, where you can basically do that sort of, because each language is a little bit different, so you need to look at your specific language how you can make an ORM. For example, in if you're doing it in JavaScript or so forth, you don't use reflection per se. You're basically creating a data structure for like Mongoose, as an example, isn't like using like some type of injection system per se. It's actually creating new instances of the data for you. So it's in a sense not. I wouldn't say that it depends on how you want to define an ORM, but I mean, you could make an argument for Mongoose. I wouldn't go as far to say that it's a perfect ORM and so forth, but it's like, I hope that you get the idea. And as for Axios, same deal there. Like, Axios is just a library around the native network interfaces. And so what it does is that it adds some convenience on top of the native interfaces. And so again, all you really have to know in order to build a tool like that is to figure out, all right, what is it actually doing? And that is as simple as looking at those interfaces and realizing that in this case, Axios is also a simple case. It's actually just adding sugar on top of the fetch function, for example, in the browser, or like the HTTP module in the well, I can't remember what the Node module is called now, but I think it's the native one, or if it's like they might have been moving over now, because I think that we're getting native fetch right to Node. I can't recall exactly, but what it's basically doing is that it's just adding convenience on top. And so if you look at those interfaces that the Axios is providing, you will figure out what they've done and what they've added, and like the things that are missing from the native APIs, and that's really all there is to it. And this is true for anything that you do. If you're going to build a compiler, if you're going to build, I don't know, like a AI, like a machine learning algorithm, or whatever you're making, it really comes down to understanding what these tools are doing and the theory behind them, and then simply trying to recreate that functionality. It's really is that simple. So what I want you to take away from this is that if you want to build your own tools like the ORMs or Axios or whatever you might, I don't even know what more you might want to build, it comes down to, simply said, that you have to understand what these tools are doing. That's all the knowledge you really need. Once you know how to code, you know all you need to know in terms of like practical like coding skills. Because if you can build a REST API, you can, it's the same programming language, it's the same everything for like the building of these sorts of tools. Usually it really comes down to, do you understand how they work? That's the whole thing, right? When you're coding, like, code is always code, guys. This is why I tell people that this idea that you can build something that is, that is not comprehensible to anybody else, etc., is bullshit, because at the end of the day, code is just code. It doesn't matter if you're working at Google or if you're working at a tiny startup. If you're using the same programming language, etc., you might be writing things in different ways and so forth, but it is still just code. It works the same way. It comes down to, do you understand the theory? Like, what do you understand the logic, etc., etc.? That's usually the determining factor. And in this instance, that's exactly what it is. It's no different from if you wanted to build your own operating system. If you want to build your own operating system, it's the same deal. You have to understand what an operating system does and the components that make up an operating system. And for ORMs, if you want to learn those skills, I'm pretty sure there's quite a lot of articles out there that you can read about to learn how ORMs works and so forth and so forth. I just gave you like a really clumsy explanation of like the basics of what these concepts are, but if you go and look them up, you get a much more in-depth understanding. And then you have to realize that this is sort of the same deal as learning how to make REST APIs. You build something really shitty over and over and over, and then sooner or later you're going to be able to build really awesome ORMs or like network clients or whatever you're doing, right? really comes down to practice once you've figured out how it works. Have a great day.